Hey, Team Bio. Oh, I think I need to move. This desk is too bumpy. Sorry. Okay, welcome to your screencast on Intro to Water. But before we talk about Intro to Water, I just want to briefly mention this fall. We've got a couple different themes going on, as you might have noticed. We've been talking about principles of ecology. We've introduced the idea of evolution, change in allele frequency over time. We've talked about phylogenetic trees and the diversity of life, the three domains, and then different kingdoms, prokaryotes and eukaryotes, those ideas. At the same time, we're also definitely asking, what does it mean to be a scientist or a biologist? We're talking about observation and questions, and we're constructing and examining models and finding exceptions to those models. And then we're thinking about experimental design and data analysis. And at the same time as those two things, we're also going to be talking about the very smallest things in biology, the chemistry of life, organic molecules, and cellular structure. And this is your first screencast that really dives into some of the chemistry of living things. So that's why we're talking about it. Water. Very important molecule. It is, all living things have aqueous solution. That's a fancy way of saying a watery solution that is on the inside and also usually on the outside of their cells. So, deeply important to life. Water is. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the relationship between the structure and the function of water, and comparing and contrasting it with some other molecules. Okay, water is a polar molecule. And it is inorganic. Contrasting it to methane, which is a nonpolar molecule, and organic. Remember, our definition of an organic molecule is a molecule that contains carbon, but even more specifically, an organic molecule is going to have carbon-carbon bonds or carbon-hydrogen bonds. Methane is organic because it contains carbon-hydrogen bonds. Okay, let's talk about what polarity means. A pole is like an opposite or an extreme, a difference of some sort. And water is a polar molecule because it has a side of the molecule that is slightly negative and a side of the molecule that is slightly positive. That's what these little symbols mean. They don't mean a whole negative charge and a whole positive charge. They mean slightly negative, slightly positive. How does it get this slightly negative and positive side to it? Well, this line here is representing a bond. It's a specific type of bond called a covalent bond. A covalent bond is a strong bond and it is actually, this line here is actually depicting or standing in the place of two shared electrons. So these are shared electrons. Hi, Dagmar. But the electrons that are in this bond are not shared equally. They're shared unequally between the oxygen and the hydrogen. The oxygen is actually pulling more strongly on the electrons than the hydrogen is. So if we were to examine where the electrons are located, we would see they're a little bit closer to the oxygen than they are to the hydrogen. And the same is true of the electrons that are in this bond over here. They're pulled more strongly by the oxygen atom. And so this leaves oxygen with an overall negative charge and hydrogen with an overall positive charge. Why does this happen? Well, this pulling on the electrons is called electronegativity. If we're to look at the periodic table, we would see that if you look across the periodic table in this direction, electronegativity is increasing. And if you look up in this direction, electronegativity is also increasing. So the reason why the electronegativity trends increases across the rows and up the columns is because as we go this way across the periodic table, so say, let's just talk about carbon, for example. The difference between carbon and nitrogen is that carbon has 6 protons and nitrogen has 7. So as we go this direction, we're adding more protons to the nucleus. So they're able to pull on the electrons with greater force. So why is it the case that electronegativity increases as you go up the periodic table? Because elements that are way down here have more protons in them than elements that are way up here. And the reason for this, as we jump down, as we go down a column, we increase the distance of the electrons from the nucleus. So electrons are going to be located further and further away in more extremely distributed orbitals as we go down the periodic table this way. So, why is this important? Well, this is important because oxygen, based on its position on the periodic table relative to hydrogen, is more electronegative than hydrogen, and so it's able to pull on these electrons with more force than the hydrogen is, and it makes water a polar molecule. The most electronegative element on the periodic table is fluorine, right here. You might think that these are electronegative elements, but they're actually not. These are the noble gases, and they're very stable, so maybe I should change my arrow to go this way with a stop right here. These guys are not electronegative at all. Okay, so methane. Why is methane a nonpolar molecule? You see, it is also composed of covalent bonds. So every carbon-hydrogen bond is a covalent bond. And there are 4 of them in this. I'm not going to draw lines to all of them, but you can if you want. And just like between oxygen and hydrogen, this line is representing 2 electrons. And if you look at the periodic table, you see that carbon should be maybe more electronegative than hydrogen. And it is. It's slightly more electronegative than hydrogen, but it's not. The difference in electronegativity between carbon and hydrogen is not great enough to make this a polar molecule. So methane is non-polar. The electrons are shared equally, and this compound has no charge on it, whereas water has a slightly negative and slightly positive end to it. Okay, what's next? We're talking about different types of bonds. Intramolecular bonds are bonds formed within a molecule. Like intrascholastic sports, I should say intramural sports are sports played within one school. Intramolecular bonds are bonds within a molecule. So these covalent bonds and these covalent bonds are examples of intramolecular bonds. Intermolecular bonds are bonds formed between different molecules. So interscholastic sports are sports played between people from different schools. Intermolecular bonds are bonds formed between different molecules. Okay, so why am I talking about this? This is all coming down to this big idea about oxygen being polar. It has a slightly negative side and a slightly positive side, or maybe two slightly positive sides. And this becomes important when we have more than one water molecule interacting. Oops, this is negative, slightly positive, slightly negative, slightly positive, slightly positive. Okay, so if we have multiple water molecules, as you do anytime you have a glass of water, water has the tendency to stick together. And this is because of hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding A hydrogen bond is a bond that is a weak bond. A covalent bond, this bond holding this hydrogen to this oxygen, is much stronger than this hydrogen bond, which is formed just because there's a slight difference in charge between the slightly positive end of this water molecule and the slightly negative end of this water molecule. So this hydrogen bond is going to form and then potentially break just an instant later. And then we're going to get more hydrogen bonds across all of these different interactions between the different water molecules within our solution. So all of these hydrogen bonds, when we add them all up, actually amount to a relatively significant force, even though each one individually is relatively weak and forms only because of the difference in charge on our two ends of our water molecule. Okay, so water exhibits significant hydrogen bonding, which is an intermolecular bond, a bond formed between two different water molecules. And this gives water lots of interesting properties. It means that it's really good at cohesion, which is water bonded with other water, cohesion, sticking together, and adhesion, water bonded to other polar things. And this gives water a lot of its important properties. For example, water is an excellent solvent. It's very good at dissolving things that are charged or dissolving things that are polar. So for example, salt readily dissolves in water because the ions, chloride and sodium, have a negative and positive charge when they're dissolved in water, But the negative end of the chloride can act with all the positive ends of the water molecule. So you see all the hydrogens are pointing towards the chloride, and all of the oxygens are oriented towards the sodium. So water is a fantastic solvent. It also has a really high surface tension. Because it really likes to stick to itself. Cohesion. It also exhibits this really important property called capillary action. Where water likes to stick to other water molecules, and it also likes to stick to polar tubes or polar siding of plants. And so it can be sucked up against the force of gravity due to both cohesion and adhesion, which together we call capillary action, and can move water from the roots of trees all the way hundreds of feet up into the air into the leaves. We call this process transpiration. Okay, that is all. I think this screencast turned out to be slightly longer than I wanted it to be, so I'll end it now.